Hey y'all, welcome back to the channel. I'm Duran with DuranSupply.com, where I help you design smarter, not harder. As a merchandise designer for a couple years now, I've picked up on some really good habits that have helped me excel in my career, and today I'm going to share some of that with you. So I'm going to break down this video into two categories, that is technical practices and conceptual practices. Rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? What I mean by that is I'll go over things from a technical standpoint, so things like your tools, your document setup, and etc. And also things from a conceptual standpoint, so things like your composition, colors, textures, and so on. But before I get started on all that, make sure you like and subscribe. I post videos like this every week to help you become a better designer. All right, now let's get started. So since we're starting on the technical front, I've got Photoshop open here. Let's first talk about our document setup. Whenever you're designing for print, the absolute most important thing to do is to make sure you're using a DPI of 300 or above, but the recommended would be to set it at 300, and this ensures high resolution that can easily be interpreted and used for print. Now for the actual size of the document, you're going to want to think in inches or any physical measurement instead of pixels, and the size can vary based on the needs of the printer and the print, but for every design I make, I start out on a 16 by 20 inch canvas. That is the size of an oversized screen for Screenprint. I believe the standard size is about 14 by 17 inches, but I like to have a little more leeway in case it's a big back graphic or an oversized print. 16 by 20 is also perfect 4:5 ratio, which is standard portrait size. So if you want to turn this into a poster or something for Instagram, we're working in the same ratio. So it's perfect for that too. Just an all-around good ratio to work in. Of course, whatever size you pick, you don't have to fill up the whole canvas. You can just crop it later to the actual pixel ends of the graphic. But if you want enough space to create your designs with enough resolution, you're going to pick something larger like 16 by 20 or 14 by 17. As for the color space, just work in RGB. People will tell you to work in CMYK for print, which is correct technically, but really not practically. When working in CMYK, there's some bottlenecks to a few features and blending modes in Photoshop that you really don't want to have to deal with when you're designing merchandise. So really it's best to just stick to RGB, and I'll explain a little bit more on that in a second here. Now here's the problem. Your design is actually going to be printed in CMYK, and CMYK yields a little bit less color depth and vibrancy as compared to RGB. So think of RGB as like the full color spectrum and CMYK as a little sliver of that. So CMYK is used for print, and there's a limited amount of colors that can be printed due to how the ink is mixed. So you want to preview your designs in CMYK to see what it would actually look like when it gets printed, but you don't want to be working in an actual CMYK color space document. So since we don't want all the bottlenecks that come with working in CMYK, we're going to be working in an RGB document and actually just previewing how our design looks in CMYK by using the keyboard shortcut Command or Control Y, and this will let you kind of see how your RGB document would look if it was CMYK, but it doesn't actually convert the color space to CMYK. So here and there while you're designing, you can just press Command or Control Y on your keyboard, and this will let you preview your design in CMYK so you can make any color adjustments needed, especially for more vibrant colors that pretty much only exist in the RGB spectrum and not CMYK. So you can go ahead and adjust those properly and as needed. Now that's some good info to have, but here is another reason that I work in RGB and why you should too. Unless you are heavily involved in the printing process or you are the printer, you want to leave the color thing up to the printer. Let the printer handle the print. They're going to have to convert the color space anyway to whatever they need and whatever is specific to their machines and their process, and you really don't want to get in the way of that. So usually I just leave all the color stuff up to the printer, and I keep in contact with them if possible to make sure they handle that tastefully. Now let's talk a little bit about DTG versus Screenprint. These are the two most common printing methods for t-shirts and just merchandise design in general. So in short, DTG just uses digital printing methods to get the ink onto the garment. And since it's a newer technology, you have a lot more leeway in terms of detail and color in terms of your color palette, but there are of course a lot of cons to DTG printing. To name a few, it's really not as cost effective as something like Screenprint because the machines can only print pretty much one shirt at a time. So it's really better for smaller batches or just for samples. The prints also typically come out duller and have less vibrancy, and can even come out looking pretty horrible depending on what machines the printer and the printer company is using. You also have less options in terms of where you can place your design on the garment, and you have less options in terms of printing effects. So something like puff print doesn't really exist in the DTG world, but overall not a bad printing method, just has its pros and cons just like any other printing method. Now screen printing, usually the better option. But why? The colors are more vibrant, the prints typically last longer, and it's more cost effective for larger batches. And I personally think screen printed stuff looks and feels a lot better on a t-shirt, but you are very limited in terms of your color palette, and you will see less detail on a screen print than you would in a DTG print, which can either work for or against you depending on the quality of your images. So to recap, DTG is better for small batches of prints with very high detail and a lot of colors going on in the color palette, but it lacks endurance and quality. Screen print is better for large batches and for more vibrant prints, but you do have a very limited color palette, which you're sacrificing for higher print quality and longer endurance. Now, 90% of the time, you're not going to be too much involved in the printing process, so you don't have to worry too much about all that, but you do want to stay informed and ask yourself or your client what printing process is going to be used on the design so that you can design accordingly. If it's DTG, you can use as many colors as you want and work in as tiny and minuscule detail as you want. If it's screen print, which is pretty standard, you're going to limit your color palette as much as possible without sacrificing the integrity or quality of the design. One thing to note, you're not always going to accurately assess the amount of colors in terms of ink that's going to be used in your design, so just keep in touch with the client and ask questions as needed and adjust as needed. Now let's talk a little bit about deliverables, since that ties in sort of to the type of print. Deliverables just means basically the files that you're sending off to print. You'll pretty much be sticking to two file formats, that is PNG or PSD. Ideally, it would be PSD because you want the printer to be able to open up that layered file and adjust things accordingly, such as the colors, the layers, and things like that, so they can get the most accurate print. But I have sent PNG to clients if it's a really simple or a spot color print. Spot color meaning the printer isn't really going to have to use things like halftones or a simulated process to simulate other colors using very few colors. PNG will also be asked for sometimes if you're printing with DTG, especially if you're doing like a print on demand service. And they ask for this because with a PNG file, you can of course have the transparent background, but when you send your PNG to whoever it is, the printer or the direct-to-garment service, you want to make sure that the background is actually transparent and that it's just your design on the transparent background. That's something that sort of comes in handy when you send a PSD file because, of course, if your design isn't separated from the background, the printer can go into the file and do that themselves however they need to do it. So most of the time, and if possible, you're going to want to send the printer a layered file like a PSD so that they can go in and do whatever is needed to color separate that artwork accurately. Make sure you organize and you name your layers before you do that so that the printer doesn't open up your PSD file and let out a big sigh. That's especially the case for screen print. There's a little more nuance when printing DTG. It really depends on the printer, but for both DTG and screen printing, above all, you're going to want to make sure that your background is entirely separate from your design layer. Ideally, your background is transparent, especially if it is a PNG file. There are a few ways to do that, which I'll have to cover in a separate video just to spare time. But off the top, you could use things like the color range function in Photoshop or blend if in the layer styles. Or like I said, if possible, just let the printer handle it. Now, finally, let's get into the conceptual end of merchandise design. I'll speak on this pretty briefly because a lot of this is up to creative interpretation, but I do want to set some guidelines for you. The first thing I want to talk about is composition. Think strong and hard about the canvas that your design is going on. I'm not talking about your Photoshop canvas. I'm talking about the t-shirt or the long sleeve or the hoodie that you're designing for. This one is pretty obvious, but just don't do things like design a sleeve design that obviously doesn't fit on a sleeve. You know, if you're designing for a t-shirt, keep in mind how it's going to fit on someone's body. A lot of times you'll see a small front chest design or a little design on the center of a t-shirt and a big party design on the back. That is because of the contours of the human body. When you're wearing a tee, the front of it is going to be more distorted than, say, the back of it, which is a flatter surface, unless, of course, the customer is a bodybuilder or something. But most of the time, the back is going to be a flatter surface, and so when you put a big designer there, it just reads better. You can also get away more with bottom weighting your design for a t-shirt, which pretty much means having the design get perceptually heavier or more detailed towards the bottom of the design, just because it is a flatter surface down there, and also towards the bottom of a t-shirt, the shape of it is more rectangular, so it's more standard to like an actual canvas, whereas the top of a t-shirt gets more finicky and curved in terms of shape. So that's just something you want to be aware of. One more thing, you want to use the negative space of the garment to your advantage to frame your artwork. You don't really want to have your designs too close to the seams or the collar of a t-shirt, just because it's going to look weird and weighted unevenly when it's on body. So those are all things you want to keep in mind when you're designing a t-shirt, and I strongly recommend that you mock up your design before you actually finish the design. This is of course going to let you see how it's actually going to look on the t-shirt or the hoodie or the long sleeve or whatever it might be. Personally, I always do that right before I finish a design to make sure that the composition of the design works well on that garment, and I can make any changes and adjust as needed in terms of the shape and the perceptual weight and dynamics of that design. And of course, quick plug, I do sell mock-ups for every garment there is, or most garments there are. So t-shirts, hoodies, long sleeve, jeans even. So go check out my website, that is duransupply.com, and get yourself some mock-ups for 15% off using the code YouTube15. And while you're at it, go check out the tons of tools and assets that I have available for you on that same site, duransupply.com, and these will all help you become a better merchandise designer. I got things like text effects, image effects, and templates, textures, and so on. So go check that out and use the discount code YouTube15 for 15% off your order. Of course, guys, you don't have to use my mockups. You can use any mockups that you find out there. There are, of course, some free ones on the web, but you do want to always mock up your design before you actually send it off to print or anything like that, just so you can see how the composition works on that garment or on the t-shirt and adjust accordingly. Mockups are also great to send to your printer so that they can gauge pretty much the size, the framing, and the spacing of your design on that garment. So definitely something you want to make a habit. Let's also talk about things you want to minimize doing in a t-shirt design for the sake of how it's going to look when it gets printed. So things you might want to stay away from are expansive, really drawn out gradients, really thin lines, colors that are too close to the color of the garment, dots or halftones that are too small, things that are really blurry either by choice or just by nature of the image. All of that for the simple fact that those things usually don't print very well because of physical limitations, and obviously you don't want a botched t-shirt in the end of things. So just keep in mind that things that look good digitally aren't always going to look good when translated to a physical medium, just because of the obviously physical limitations. This also applies to fonts and whatnot, so be sure to choose fonts that are readable but also complement your design. Pay attention to the spacing and the size of it, especially relative to the rest of the graphic. In the end, you want a balanced composition that uses visual hierarchy and dynamics to pretty much tell a story. You want the design to not only look good on the t-shirt, but also have the t-shirt contextualize the design, meaning keep in mind both the visual balance of the composition and the design, but also the fact that someone is going to be wearing that on a physical t-shirt, which in layman's terms, you just want someone to actually want to wear that t-shirt. You don't want to design something that's hard to wear, whether that means the design can easily be coordinated with other things in an outfit to create a fire fit, or conveys a message that complements the person wearing it or the rest of the outfit that they have on, or it just straight up doesn't suck and it doesn't say something that someone won't want to wear on a t-shirt. It doesn't have imagery that someone won't want to wear on a shirt. So this is very important. Just consider the audience before you design the t-shirt, while you design the t-shirt, and even as you're sending the files to print, and make sure that the design you made is suitable for that audience. Design with the customer in mind. All right, guys, that is pretty much it. There are a few concepts in this video that I'd like to expand on in future videos. I just wanted to give you an outline of things to think about before you start making a t-shirt design or any merchandise design. If you have any requests for other topics to speak on in other videos, please let me know down in the comments. And of course, if you got value from this video, make sure you like and subscribe. I post videos like this every week to help you become a better designer. While you're at it, go check out duransupply.com. I have tons of tools and assets and mockups to help you up your merch design game. Be sure to use the code YouTube15 for 15% off your order. That's all I got to say. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.